Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of this series of Centenary London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Sincere apologies to those of you who haven't got a chair. I mean, it's wonderful to see such a full house. Are there no chairs in the back room that we can arrange? No. Well, your commitment is admirable. I hope you're not too uncomfortable down there. It's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Peter Adamson. Peter is Professor of Philosophy in Late Antiquity and the Islamic World at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich and a Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy at KCL. A recipient of numerous academic awards, he's renowned and unusual in today's intellectual scene in being fluent not only in Western philosophy, but also in Islamic philosophy, and he's been extending his expertise to Indian, African, and Chinese traditions as well. So perhaps it's unsurprising that his well-known podcast series is called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. It's had more than 25 million downloads so far, so it's a real privilege to have you here in person. Peter, over to you.
Hi, thanks for coming. Sorry, I'll repeat the apology for those of you who didn't get a seat and are standing in the back. Out of solidarity, I'm going to stand too while I talk. Okay, so this paper is about Avicennan and Cartesian doubt, and I will explain what I mean by that shortly. But first, I wanted to say something by way of giving a thin veneer of relevance to the general topic of this series of lectures, which is that this is a centenary series of lectures. And so I thought I would say something about the last 100 years of philosophy. And what I have to say about that is really about the last 100 years of the study of my specialist discipline within philosophy, which is not just history of philosophy, but history of philosophy in the Islamic world. So I was thinking about this question, well, how has philosophy in the Islamic world been seen over the last century or so? And I'm actually now old enough that I lived through some of that, like a significant amount. So I got my PhD in 2000. And when I got my PhD, given that it was on philosophy in Arabic, one of my professors said, well, you're diving into the shallow end of the job pool because nobody works on this. And indeed, back then it was a real niche discipline, and like a small niche, like the kind of niche you could put a small vase in with a flower arrangement. Maybe it's still a niche discipline, but maybe now it's like a nook discipline, which has enough room for a sofa bed, which is appropriate because you're all invited to come and visit. So things have changed a lot, and this is not 100 years ago, but I thought I would mention Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, in part because, of course, he's a rival in the competition to be the central person writing a single author history of the entirety of philosophy, right? So me and Bertrand, we're sort of, the good thing about Bertrand Russell is he's not getting any better at this stage. So he famously wrote this History of Western Philosophy, which actually is very interesting, of course, because he was an interesting guy. And one of the least interesting parts of it is what he says about philosophy in the Islamic world. In my field, this is kind of notorious. So there's these few pages about it. And there's this one sentence which people always quote, which is, Arabic philosophy is not important as original thought. Men like Avicenna and Averroes are essentially commentators, which is just like insanely wrong. So for one thing, Avicenna, I'm actually going to call him Ibn Sīnā because that was his real name. Ibn Sīnā wasn't a commentator at all. And in fact, he was very sort of ostentatiously not a commentator. He wrote original works. He was self-consciously very, very original. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, was a commentator on Aristotle, but was also important as an original thinker, right? So people always quote this to kind of abuse the ignorance of what people thought about this in the 1940s. I have some sympathy with Russell because, of course, he wasn't really in a very good position to know otherwise, right? So he's actually following even earlier authors back in the 19th century, even like René, who also thought of philosophy in the Islamic world or philosophy in Arabic as a kind of stopgap or filler between ancient philosophy and Latin medieval philosophy. I sometimes call this the torchbearer model for understanding philosophy in the Islamic world. So the idea is we've got this sort of flame of wisdom, which is first kindled amongst the Greeks and is then passed on to the Arabic-speaking world. And the kind of historical destiny of philosophy in the Islamic world is simply to hold on to philosophy and keep the fires burning until we're ready to receive it, because of course we're thinking of all this from the point of view of Europe. So we're ready to receive it again around the end of the 12th century, when we have the Arabic Latin translation movement. So just as Greek philosophy is translated into Arabic around the 9th century, so Arabic philosophy is translated into Latin around the 12th century. So on this reckoning, these guys didn't need to produce anything original, right? Because their task is basically to keep Aristotelianism alive, Greek philosophy in general, but especially Aristotelianism alive, until the Latins can kind of stop doing whatever people did in the Dark Ages, like eating mud, and start doing philosophy again. Now, this is no longer how we think about it. And actually, these are shifts that have happened not even just in the last 100 years, but even in the last 25 years while I've been in the field. So one is to, and I think this does go back before I got my PhD, let's say, one is to think of the philosophers who Russell discarded as not original as being very original and interesting in their own right, to study them in Arabic, in the original Arabic texts, rather than the Latin translations, which actually was surprisingly common even when I was a graduate student. So you would see like articles published about Avicenna where the author of the article doesn't know Arabic and is just using the medieval Latin translation and doesn't apologize, even though the Arabic is extant, right? Which is kind of weird, right? Like you wouldn't do that with Aristotle. So why would you do it with these guys? So that's been one shift. But then the other shift, which has been, I think, more momentous and more recent, and this has even happened maybe in the last 15 years, is that the torchbearer model has really been discarded. So now, instead of thinking of philosophy as kind of moving from Greek into Arabic and Arabic into Latin, now we think about it more as a kind of Y shape. So Greek philosophy comes into Arabic. It's actually more complicated than this, but for the purposes of this evening, I'll keep it simple. So Greek philosophy comes into Arabic, and then Arabic philosophy is translated into Latin and is very influential there. But in addition, it continues in the Islamic world. So we have this huge number of philosophers who are responding to Ibn Sīnā and who continue to do that for centuries, kind of in parallel with the Latin tradition. So if you think of it as a Y shape, then the point in the middle of the Y would be Ibn Sīnā, because these two traditions branch off from him. And I and a lot of other people have been working on these authors who come along later, and these are people who are not famous, right? So for example, I'll mention this one guy because I'm going to bring him up later. There's a philosopher theologian named Fakhruddin Arazi who lives in the 12th century, so he dies early in the 13th century, and he is a commentator, but not on Aristotle, on Ibn Sīnā, and he writes these huge original works working through a lot of topics from Ibn Sīnā's philosophy in his own right. And he's kind of like the recent discovery in our field, like everybody's publishing on Fakhruddin Arazi. If you go to a conference on philosophy in the Islamic world, there will always be a paper on him now. So in 10 years, hopefully his name will be quite well known, even beyond the confines of the field. And actually, what's happening here is that I think we're starting to see that philosophy in what people sometimes call the post-classical era is very much like Latin scholastic philosophy. So we have these very long works full of lots of distinctions and arguments. So Fakhruddin will often say, well, here's a philosophical problem. There's two positions. For the first position, there are 16 arguments, and here are refutations of the 16 arguments. For the second position, there are 7 arguments, of which 5 don't work, but 2 are fairly convincing, but God knows best, That would be a very typical way of him addressing an issue. So it feels a lot like Latin scholasticism. And I think that the two shifts I've just mentioned might help us do something that was already very common in, so let's say, the 1980s or 90s, which is to compare what's happening in philosophy of the Islamic world to various developments in European philosophy, in part because we have the advantage of these post-classical commentators who are helping us understand Ibn Sīnā, and in part because we just have a better grip on what Ibn Sīnā himself was up to. And I want to present to you an example tonight. So thinking about sort of the kind of standard things that people bring up when they compare European philosophy to things from the Islamic world, there's kind of two cliches, or two examples that are so familiar that they've become cliches. And I'm going to talk about one of them tonight. So the one I'm not going to talk about is the famous discussion of miracles in a theologian named Al-Ghazali, who's one of these guys who responds to Ibn Sīnā very critically in this case. So he wrote a work called On the Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahawud al-Falasifa, in which he condemns Ibn Sīnā for saying various things that he considers to be incompatible with Islam. Among them, what he considers to be Ibn Sīnā's denial of the possibility of miracles. By the way, the title of that work, Incoherence of the Philosophers, is telling because it's actually an attack on Ibn Sīnā, right? But he just considers Ibn Sīnā to be synonymous with philosophy or philosophers. He's not attacking Aristotle, he's attacking Ibn Sīnā. So that shows you how dominant Ibn Sīnā has become in the post-classical era. He's basically replaced Aristotle as the main thinker that everyone has to respond to. I often say that Ibn Sīnā is a little bit like Kant in this respect. So once Kant happens, everyone has to think about Kant all the time, whether they want to or not, right? And it's the same thing here. So anyway, Ghazali has this discussion of miracles in which he says, well, these philosophers are so sure that there are necessary connections between things here in the natural world, and that necessity rules out miracles. So for example, if fire touches something, then it has to burn, right? But actually, we don't see any causation there. We just see a kind of correlation between the contact of fire and the burning. And of course, people have gotten very excited about this because this sounds so much like David Hume, right? Actually, if you think about this a little bit more broadly, maybe the parallel is not that exact. I mean, after all, Hume is not famous as a defender of miracles, right? And in fact, the broader picture is that Ghazali is defending the idea that God is directly causing everything to happen in the universe, not just miracles. So if you were going to compare Ghazali to something in early modern philosophy, you should compare him to Malebranche or other occasionalists, not to Hume. But as I say, I'm not going to talk about this. If you want, you can ask me about this later if you're curious about it. What I am going to talk about is Ibn Sīnā and Descartes. So Ibn Sīnā has a famous thought experiment called the flying man thought experiment. We're going to look at it in some depth now. But let me tell you the setup first. So imagine that God creates, actually hands up who already knows about the flying man. Weirdly, knowing about the flying man correlates very strongly with being either at the front or the back of the room. I can't explain that. So like really early comers and really late comers. Okay, so here's the idea. So God creates a human from nothing. This human has just been created, right? So has no memories and is in midair, arms and legs stretched out and even fingers stretched out so that this man who's in midair flying is not in contact with his own body. His sight is veiled. There's no sound. And obviously he's not smelling or tasting anything. The reason he has to be in midair with his limbs splayed out like that is that he's not touching anything either. Okay? So we could think of this as him being in complete sensory deprivation. And then the question is, what, if anything, would this person know? And Ibn Sīnā says, obviously, there is something he would know, namely that he exists. So you have some kind of access to your own existence without the benefit of any sensation, and also without being able to use your memory or your imagination, because he thinks, I mean, obviously he can't remember anything because he's only just been created. But Ibn Sīnā would say that he can't imagine anything either, because imagination always works with things you've previously acquired through sensation. So you would think that his mind would just be a blank, right? But Ibn Sīnā thinks it's obvious that he'd be self-aware. And since he's aware of himself and not aware of his body, his self must be distinct from his body. Okay? That's the flying man thought experiment. Now, people, including my former colleague here in London, Richard Siraji, have always, not always, but have often compared this to Descartes' cogito, which I guess I probably don't need to explain. But remember the way the meditations works, right? You try to doubt or Descartes tries to doubt everything. Then he discovers there's one thing he can't doubt, because it's incoherent to doubt whether you yourself exist, right? Because even to doubt, you must exist. Hence, I think, therefore I am, right? Or better, I doubt, therefore I am. And because both the cogito and the flying man seem to involve this appeal to self-awareness or the certainty of your own existence, people have often compared these two passages. So just jumping ahead. So people have often thought that the cogito and the flying man thought experiment are trying to make similar points. So, sorry, I was supposed to go ahead to the slide here. So just as the Hume-Ghazali comparison is maybe not such a great comparison, so I think the comparison between the thought experiment and the cogito is at best inexact. So obviously both do involve some kind of immediate access to your own existence, but Ibn Sīnā's point has nothing to do with overcoming hyperbolic doubt. So hyperbolic doubt is what people sometimes call Descartes' project at the beginning of the meditations. You try to doubt everything and you see whether there's anything you cannot doubt. That's not what Ibn Sīnā is doing at all. There's nothing about general hyperbolic doubt. There's nothing about putting every belief you have to the test and seeing whether it can be doubted. That's not something Ibn Sīnā ever considers, actually. And also, Descartes is not trying to use the cogito to prove that the soul or the mind is distinct from the body. That's something that's easy to overlook because, of course, Descartes is famous for being a dualist, right? But that's not the point of the cogito. The point of the cogito, I think, therefore I am, is to prove that there is, maybe not prove, it's disputed whether it's a proof, but is to show, perhaps, to display that there's something that cannot be doubted. It's only later in the meditations that he starts talking about the relationship between the mind and the body. And here, I think maybe there is an interesting connection between Ibn Sīnā and Descartes, and this is what I want to talk about for the rest of this lecture. This is actually an idea that I developed along with a colleague of mine named Fedor Benovich, and it was actually Fedor who pointed this out, that if you wanted to compare something if you wanted to compare the thought experiment to something in Descartes, you shouldn't compare it to the cogito. You should compare it to the sixth meditation, where we have the defense of Cartesian dualism. And I'm going to develop that in what follows. By the way, this picture is something that was drawn by a listener to my podcast after they heard the episode on the flying man, and they thought it was so interesting that they drew this and sent it to me. So there it is. Okay, so let me now try to explain what these two arguments have to do with each other, and then we'll look at what Ibn Sīnā and Descartes do in more detail. So what they have in common, I think, is that they both use an argument of a certain kind, or a method of arguing of a certain kind, which I would call the method of doubt. And the point here is this shouldn't be confused with the hyperbolic doubt, right? As I said, that's not what Ibn Sīnā is doing. So the idea is not doubt everything and see whether anything survives. The idea is the following. If you can doubt one thing without doubting the other, then the two things are not the same. okay? So and you can see the point already with the thought experiment, the flying man thought experiment. So the idea would be that the flying man doesn't know that he has a body, right? But he does know that he exists, so he is not his body. So the idea is you're using epistemic access to things as a way of distinguishing them. That's the basic idea. Let me give you an example. In, I guess, about a week and a half, Arsenal, my team, is going to play Tottenham Hotspur. Are any Tottenham fans here? You're allowed to stay, but you may not enjoy the next minute or...
I'm convinced I would.
Right, okay. So let's say that I'm trying to decide who I think is going to play for Arsenal in a week and a half against Tottenham, okay? So actually, I certainly wouldn't pick those people. For one thing, Zinchenko is gone, but this is the best picture I could find online. So I sort of sit down and I come up with a list of 11 likely starters for Arsenal, right? And I know that Arsenal is going to play Tottenham in a week and a half. I mean, barring acts of God or whatever, but let's leave those aside. So I know there's going to be a game between Arsenal and Tottenham, but I don't know whether these 11 guys are going to play against Tottenham, right? Because injuries, I don't know who Arteta, the coach, will pick, et cetera, et cetera. And what that shows is that these 11 guys are not the same as the team Arsenal, right? They're distinct. Their identity conditions are different. There are other reasons to think that that's the case. So, for example, Arsenal is very, very old, as one of the oldest English teams, and these guys are quite young, right? So Arsenal has existed for longer than these 11 guys. Also, one of these 11 guys might move to a different team, right? They might even get traded to Spurs, God forbid. Whether they'd be willing to go is another matter. But so you can tell that they're different, right? So the team is different than the 11 people who play for the team, even though they somehow coincide. So we can say that there's a kind of conceptual distinction here, which somehow mirrors a real distinction in the world, right? The two things can and do come apart. And you can tell that they come apart because I'm in doubt about one and not the other, right? I'm in doubt about which 11 guys will play, but I'm not in doubt about whether the team will play. I'm not sure that's a great example, but it allowed me to talk about Arsenal at the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and so I couldn't resist. Okay, so let's look at how Ibn Sīnā uses this in the context of the flying man thought experiment. So I haven't given you the whole passage because it's quite long, but when he's sort of developing the argument, he makes this point: the flying man would be aware of his own existence without being aware of the existence of his body. And then he says this: that of which one is ignorant is not identical to that which is known. Okay? Which, notice, this is very similar to my formulation of the rule. If I can doubt X but not Y, then X is not identical to Y, right? So again, the test is, do I know about X? Do I know about Y? And if the answer is yes in one case and no in the other case, the two are non-identical, okay? Now, you might object to this, that ignorance is not quite the same thing as doubt, right? So in fact, strictly speaking, the flying man doesn't doubt anything about his body. He doesn't doubt whether he has a body because he doesn't even know there are bodies. So that's actually not a thought he could formulate to himself. He's never seen a body. He's never touched a body. Remember, he was only just created, so he's never experienced a body. He's not experiencing bodies now. So actually, in Sīnā, the rule, maybe the method should be called the method of ignorance or something, but that, for one thing, that doesn't sound as good, and for another, it wouldn't connect to Descartes as well. So I thought it would be better to call it the method of doubt. But still, like, the underlying principle here is really just about cognitive access or knowledge. So the better way of formulating the rule would be this: if one knows X and does not know Y, then X is not identical to Y. So in the case of the flying man, again, not to belabor the point, but just to make sure it's clear, the flying man knows his self, but he doesn't know his body. Therefore, his self is not identical to his body. Okay? And the post-classical philosopher I mentioned earlier, Fakhruddin Razi, articulates it in exactly this way when he's explaining Ibn Sina's reasoning. He says, if what is understood as A is distinct from what is understood as B, then they are two things. So not just one thing. For when we can have an intellectual grasp of one of the two while failing to grasp the other, if they were one and the same thing, then it would be true of this thing that it is both known and unknown, and then affirmation and negation would be combined. So it would be like saying that this rock is entirely blue and this rock is entirely red, or this rock is entirely blue and this rock is entirely not blue, or something like that. It can't be that this one and the same thing is both known and unknown, because inconsistent or incompatible contradictory properties would belong to one and the same thing. Some of you are already thinking of objections. I know that. I can see it in your eyes. That some of you are thinking, well, this really... You're right, but wait, we'll get there. It's not as good as it looks at first glance, but it's also not as bad as it looks as you're thinking. Okay, but before we start criticizing and thinking about how the critiques would be answered, let's look at some other applications of the same method. So one of the famous things that we have in Ibn Sina is a distinction he makes between essence and existence. So the idea roughly is that what something is distinct from whether it is. That's roughly the idea. In more technical terms, the idea is that the very nature or essence of a thing is compatible with both the thing's existing and its non-existing, unless the essence is a very special essence, the essence of a necessary being, and of course, the necessary being is God. But if you pick anything else other than God, then the essence is compatible with both existing and non-existing. In the post-Avicennan tradition, they sometimes talk about this in terms of preponderation. So you could think of it as being like a set of scales. So you've got a set of scales which is in balance, and the essence is like this set of scales which needs to be tipped towards existing or not existing. And what does that is a cause. So when God makes me exist, let's say, what he does is he preponderates my possible existence over my possible non-existence and makes me exist rather than not existing. Ibn Sina gives the example of a triangle. So this is a quotation from him. You understand the meaning of triangle while doubting whether or not existence among concrete individuals is attributed to it. Note, here he uses doubting, right? This is another reason why I call it the method of doubt, because he uses doubt as this kind of way into distinguishing essence from existence in this case. After it occurs to you that it consists of line and plane, it does not thereby occur to you that it exists in concrete individuals. So what is he saying here? The point about line and plane is that line and plane would somehow be involved in the definition of triangle, okay? So if you ask a geometer, what is a triangle? They'll say something like, it's a plane figure bounded by three intersecting lines, let's say. Now, that has many implications, right? So for example, it would have to have three internal angles. The three internal angles can be shown to equal 180 degrees. That would all somehow belong to the essence. We'll get back to this shortly. But one thing that does not follow from the definition or essence of triangle is whether there's a triangle. It says nothing about that one way or the other. And the same thing is true of human or giraffe or Arsenal football player, right? Anything that has an essence, probably Arsenal football player doesn't have an essence actually, but human does, right? So like if you take Bukayo Saka, an Arsenal football player, his essence is to, let's say, be a rational human. And you can infer many things from his being a rational human, like that he must be alive, that he must have a body, etc. But what you cannot infer is that he exists, or that he doesn't exist, right? The essence is neutral with respect to existence and non-existence. And as I say, everything is like that other than God. So God has to exist by his very nature. That's what God is for Ibn Sīnā, actually, is a necessary existent. And the way that Ibn Sīnā gets to this distinction is precisely through the method of doubt, is because you can doubt whether triangle exists while knowing exactly what triangle is, that the triangle's essence is distinguished from the triangle's existence. So if I go back to the formula, if one knows x and does not know y, then x is not identical to y. So I know triangle without knowing whether triangle exists, and that's where I know, let's say, the essence of triangle without knowing the existence of triangle, right? Because the essence doesn't tell me. Therefore, the essence of triangle is distinct from the existence of triangle. So to put this in more technical terms, existence is not what constitutes the essence of triangle, the way that, for example, plane figure helps to constitute the essence of triangle. And he makes this point actually about human or humanity. He says, take for instance humanity, the fact that it is existence in concrete individuals or in the mind is not constitutive of it, but rather additional to it. If it were constitutive of it, then since it would be impossible to form a notion of it in the soul, in the absence of its constitutive parts, it would be impossible to have an understanding of humanity in the soul while one doubts, again, this doubt test, whether or not it has existence in concrete individuals. So that's really just the same point I've been making, but in very technical language. So you know the essence of human. That doesn't tell you whether the human exists or not. Therefore, the essence is distinct from the existence. Now, this is not true for essential properties, right? Especially constitutive essential properties. So if plane figure is constitutive for triangle, then you cannot doubt whether there's a plane figure when doubting if you know that there is a triangle, right? And so triangle somehow already contains the notion of plane figure. So you can't know one and not know the other. That's the idea. So let's go back to the flying man one more time and think through how this works for the flying man. So in this scenario, we have this freshly created person. He has a direct grasp of his own existence, of his self, but he lacks a grasp of his body. And then, remember what I quoted from Ibn Sīnā, I won't go back to the slide because it was a ways back, but remember he said, what is affirmed is distinct from what is not affirmed, right? So he affirms his soul or his self, but he doesn't affirm his body. Therefore, the two are distinct. And he says this in he has several versions of the flying man, and he always makes the point this way. He always makes it in terms of what the flying man can and cannot access epistemically. So he says the flying man would be ignorant of the existence of all his limbs, yet he would know the existence of his being as one single thing. So he's unaware of his limbs, he's aware of his self. Or, in this situation, the flying man affirms that his self exists, yet he does not affirm any of his external limbs nor anything internal, in other words, to his body, by using his senses. And it is known, again, same rule, what is affirmed is different from what is not affirmed. Okay, now things get a little bit more complicated. And here I'm already starting to kind of anticipate the answer to the objections that may be occurring to some of you. Even if it's true that I can't tell by inspecting my own self that I have a body, maybe I do have a body anyway, right? Or maybe a clearer example would be this. So think of a triangle. So nothing about the essence of triangle tells me what color it is, right? But some triangles are blue, right? Why? Because some cause has come along, like a painter, and made a blue triangle, a sort of added blue color to the triangle. Or for that matter, here I am existing. In fact, we're all existing. Well done, us. So we're all existing. Why? Well, not because of our essences, but because of some cause which has made us exist. Maybe it's our parents, maybe it's God, whatever it is. So in general, things can have features or properties that belong to them without being part of their essence because something else has made it happen. In fact, maybe what has made it happen even has made it happen necessarily, right? Like God makes me exist. If God makes me exist, then I necessarily exist. I don't necessarily exist in the sense that God does, because I'm not a necessary being, but God has made it necessary that I exist, right? And maybe the flying man has to have a body. It's just that he can't tell, right? So you can't tell from inspecting the essence of the self that it's connected to a body, and yet nonetheless it is indeed connected to a body. And Ibn Sīnā would say, yes, that's absolutely right. So maybe there's some kind of external or extrinsic connection between the body and the self. That could happen. In fact, it does happen. We do have bodies. It's just that that's not essential to us as selves. Okay, let's now look at Descartes, and we're basically going to see a lot of the same stuff. So go back again to the cogito. So what happens in the cogito? Well, Descartes says that he has a grasp of himself as existing. This is something he cannot doubt. And what he is grasping is himself as a thinking thing, right? He doesn't grasp his body. He only grasps that he is thinking. I think, therefore I am. In the objections that some people wrote to the meditations, one of the objections was, you could just as well say, I walk, therefore I am, right? Anything that you do proves that you're existing. And Descartes said, no, because when I'm walking, I am not sure that I'm walking. Maybe I just think I'm walking, right? An evil demon is making me think that I'm walking. So these people have missed the point. The only thing I can be sure that I'm doing is thinking, right? Everything else that I'm doing, everything else that I am, is in doubt. And so then he sort of returns to this in the sixth meditation and says, the only thing that I can be certain about what I am is a thinking being and not anything about my body. And this is really how he gets to the famous position of Cartesian dualism, so separation between two kinds of substance, the mind and the body, or the soul and the body. He uses mind and soul interchangeably. So in the second meditation, which is where we have the cogito, he doesn't really argue for dualism. The closest he gets is this passage, I think. I know that I exist. The question is, what is this I that I know? If the I is understood strictly as we've been taking it, then it's quite certain that knowledge of it does not depend on things of whose existence I am as yet unaware. But then he explicitly says, now what this I is, like metaphysically, what it's like, I won't talk about that yet. But he comes back to it later in the sixth meditation. And his argument looks a lot like Ibn Sīnā's. I mean, it doesn't at first glance, but once we have gone through all this stuff about the method of doubt, I think you'll see that it looks a lot like what Ibn Sīnā does. So this is a bit long, but I think it's worth reading out. I know that everything which I clearly and distinctly understand is capable of being created by God so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. The fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they are capable of being separated, at least by God. Thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence, except that I am a thinking thing, I can infer that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. True, I may have a body, this is the point I just made, right? I may have a body that is very closely joined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, not extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of body, insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I'm really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Now, one thing about that passage is that it might look, especially at the beginning, like he's saying, so this thing about, well, God could create the two things separately, right? So it might look like he's making a kind of medieval scholastic style argument, like if God can create A without creating B, then A is not the same as B. But actually, I think that's not the fundamental argument. Rather, it's the other way around. He's saying, well, because A is distinct from B, that God could create one without creating the other. How do I know that the two are distinct? Well, because I'm certain about one and I'm not certain about the other. So one can be doubted, one cannot. And that shows that they're distinct. And you can see this from the way that he, sorry, did I skip over a slide here? Yes. So how do we know this? Through the method of doubt. And we see this from other places where he discusses this. For example, in a letter to his friend Avicenna, he wrote, "Do you claim that if we clearly understand one thing apart from another, this is not sufficient for the recognition that the two things are really distinct? If so, you must provide a more reliable criterion for a real distinction, and I am confident that none can be provided." So this is really his version of Avicenna's rule about that which is affirmed is distinct from that which is not affirmed. And this is consistent in his works. So, for example, in the responses he wrote to the objections that were written against the meditations, like Arnaud's, he wrote, "The mind can be perceived distinctly and completely, that is, sufficiently for it to be considered as a complete thing, without any of the forms or attributes by which we recognize that body is a substance, as I think I showed quite adequately in the second meditation. Similarly, a body can be understood distinctly as a complete thing without any of the attributes which belong to the mind." And something that's important here is his repeated use of the word complete. So what he's saying here is that if I have a complete grasp of the mind that doesn't involve any reference to the body and vice versa, then I know that the two things are distinct, right? Imagine that I have a partial grasp of two things. That wouldn't be enough. So let's say triangle and square. So I know triangle and square are both plane figures, right? But that's not enough to tell me that they're identical, because there's something else I need to know about them, namely that one has 3 sides and one has 4 sides. But if I've got a complete grasp of both, then I can tell by their sort of inspecting their essences whether or not they're identical. That's his point. And this explains how both of them would answer the objection that I was expecting you all to have in mind. So remember, I kept saying, well, if I know one thing but I don't know another, then they must be distinct, right? And probably you all thought, what about Spiderman? Right? No? Okay, so I'm sure maybe some of you thought about Superman, but the point is the same. So Spiderman, I know Spiderman, right? He's on the news all the time, right? Saving New York? It's New York, right? Saving New York from Dr. Octopus. But I've never even met Peter Parker, right? So Spider-Man must be distinct from Peter Parker. Oh, but in fact, they're the same guy, right? This is sometimes called the masked man fallacy. So I grasp one thing without grasping another. That doesn't mean that they're non-identical, right? It's just that I don't know that they're identical, right? So that is a good objection to sometimes. If you want to get technical, this is what philosophers call the difference between an intentional and extensional way of grasping something, but that doesn't matter. The point is that this would sometimes be a problem, but I think it's not a problem for Avicenna and Descartes because of this point about complete grasping, right? So you have a complete grasp of the essence of something without grasping this other thing. So you completely grasp A without grasping B. That must rule out that A is identical to B. Because if you have a complete grasp of A, you would know whether or not it was B. For example, if you have a complete grasp of the mind and a complete grasp of the body, this is what we just saw Descartes saying, then you can just see that they're not the same, right? One is non-extended, one is extended. But even if you can have a complete grasp of B without knowing, of A, without knowing about B at all, that's already enough to rule out that A is identical to B. That's their claim. And Descartes actually says this explicitly because he was confronted, unlike in Sīnā, he was actually confronted with the charge that he was making the masked man fallacy. And he said, no, I'm not, because while the soul is in doubt, again, doubt, about the existence of all material things, it knows itself, Latin, praecise tantum, in the strict sense only, as an immaterial substance. In spite of this, we're not sure that there's nothing corporeal in the soul, even though we do not recognize anything corporeal in it. Why is he saying that last thing? That's the other part of the defense. So even though I can say there's nothing essential to the soul that says that it has to have a connection to the body, maybe it still has a connection to the body, right? I haven't ruled that out. And in fact, it does have a connection to the body, right? We do have bodies, but the flying man wouldn't know this because when he grasps himself, he's not grasping his body, right? The body is external to him. And the same thing goes for Descartes. So the connection to the body is there, but it's not part of the essence of the soul. So it's actually a very limited kind of argument. All that these arguments do is show that the mind or the soul is not essentially connected to a body and is not identical to a body, but they do not tell us whether or not the mind could ever exist without a body. They certainly don't rule out that the mind is connected to a body. That's all open for further discussion. So, for example, you cannot use these arguments to show that the soul can survive the death of the body. All you can do is show that the connection to the body is not essential to the soul. So what's really important here is that we're only invoking the method of doubt on the basis of complete grasping. They both talk about it in terms of completeness. Of course, Descartes also talks about it in terms of having clear and distinct ideas. And it's really that kind of grasping that allows us to postulate distinctions of this kind. So Descartes, interestingly, uses the same example that we found in Sīnā of a triangle to make the point. He says, if I think of a triangle, then whenever I apprehend as being contained in the idea of a triangle, for example, that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, I can with truth assert of the triangle. So just on the basis of my clear and distinct idea, I can figure out everything essentially true of it. But the other stuff, I don't know. The stuff that's non-essentially true of it is open for debate. Okay, I have just a couple more minutes about one other thing that I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to give you a quote because I thought this captures the point so well. This scholar named René Descartes said, if thought were in fact a mode of extension, Descartes would recognize at this point that his idea of himself, a thinking thing, depends on the idea of extension or of extended substance. Given that he knows he's a thinking thing, he would now see that he is also a body, but he doesn't. So he concludes that this notion of himself does not depend on bodies. This is a very nice explanation of what I'm calling the method of doubt, but in counterfactual terms. Like if I had to be a body, then when I grasp if my soul had to be a body or had to be connected to a body by its very nature, then when I grasp the nature of my soul, I would see that, but I don't. Therefore, the connection to the body is at most accidental. And we see the same kind of reasoning in other parts of their philosophy. So this is just a point I wanted to end on because I think it's interesting. Both Descartes and Avicenna were confronted by people whose physics involved void space or vacuum. In other words, empty space. And both of them thought that this was impossible. So for them, the world is full. There's no emptiness, not even microscopic emptiness. And interestingly, both of them have opponents. So in the case of Ibn Sīnā, it's another philosopher named Arazi. This is not the same as Fakhruddin Arazi. This is an earlier guy named Abu Bakr Arazi. They're both from the same city. That's why they have the same last name, so to speak. So Ibn Sīnā is arguing against this guy, Abu Bakr Arazi, and Descartes is arguing against Pierre Gassendi, who actually tried to use the method of doubt against them. So they said, well, I can imagine that God creates space without putting anything in it. So I could doubt whether every space has to be full of body. Therefore, space and body are distinct. So space can be empty, right? This is an argument that they both gave. Gassendi gives the example of eliminating the realm around the earth and leaving the heavens still there. So that you have a kind of hole, like a donut. It is a cosmos in the shape of a donut, right? Except 3-dimensional. And he says, well, that's possible, right? God could do that. Therefore, there must be some void space there that's being filled with the body of the earth. And interestingly, Razi has a very similar thought experiment where he says, imagine that the universe just vanishes. What would be left? And the answer is empty space. So it's like this conceptual test that's very much like the method of doubt. Like I can grasp void in the absence of grasping body, therefore there must be void, sort of having bodies superimposed on top of it. And the way that they argue, that Ibn Sīnā and Descartes argue against this is exactly what you would expect. They would say, no, that's incompatible with the essence of body. Because body just is three-dimensional extension. This is the way Descartes would do it. And so Descartes says, I clearly and distinctly see and know that body and space, which you think, you Gassendi, to be two distinct things because of some unknown blindness of intellect, are completely one and the same thing. So your attempted use of the method of doubt doesn't work. Why not? Because you've misapprehended the essence of body. This thing you're calling space is just three-dimensional extension. That's what body is. So actually, if you do it correctly, you would say, okay, what is space? It's three-dimensional extension by its very essence. What is body? It's three-dimensional extension by its very essence. Therefore, they're identical. This is the reverse move from the move that he makes with dualism, where he says that body and soul have two different essences and are therefore non-identical. Or as Descartes put it, I quite like this, in a letter to Mersenne, it's no less impossible that there be a space that is empty than there be a mountain without a valley. So the only problem with this is that this looks massively question-begging, right? So if I just define body as three-dimensional extension, of course I've ruled out that there's space, which is distinct from body, and of course Gassendi would not accept the definition of body as three-dimensional extension, so they're kind of talking past each other. In this case, I think Ibn Sīnā does better than Descartes, because although he says something similar, namely that the essence of extension excludes it being empty, he gives another argument, which we could illustrate using the example of a football. So imagine that we have a region of space which is the same size as a football, okay? And then we have the football that's occupying it, right? Now Ibn Sīnā says, okay, what is the difference between these two extensions, these two football-shaped extensions of space, the size of the football, if you want, and the region of space? Well, there is no difference. You can't individuate them. They are exactly the same size. They're both extensions, and there's nothing else you can say about them that differentiates one from the other. Therefore, the two are not distinct. So this is not question-begging. I think this is an argument from the unavailability of any kind of individuation. Oops, sorry, skipped to the funny last slide by mistake. So I think that, though, that really this shows that there's a kind of problem with the method, which is that it appeals so much to our intuitions, right? And our confidence that, like, I know the essence of A, so I can rule out that A is B. That's a move that's only as good as your claim to have grasped the essence of A, right? And anyone who rejects your definition of A or your grasp of the essence of A is not going to accept your attempt to distinguish A and B. Now, to be fair, both of them have kind of taken account of that in two ways, as we saw. One is they say, well, you do have to have a correct and complete grasp of the essence. If you don't, you're not allowed to use this method of doubt, right? That's a very significant concession or caveat. And, it means that they do have to defend their essential definitions of space, of soul, of body, whatever it may be. So you can't just sort of pound the table and say, but I have a strong intuition. You actually have to convince your interlocutor that you have defined the essence correctly. And also don't forget that there could be these extrinsic connections, even necessary extrinsic connections, that show that, for example, the soul does have to have a body, right? So there are various limitations to this, but nonetheless, I think that this kind of argument, even if it's shielded from the objection of the mass man fallacy, does have the problem that it tends to look very question-begging. And the reason it tends to look very question-begging is that you're essentially building the conclusion that you want into your definition of the essence, right? So I want to show that A and B are distinct. Therefore, I just define A in such a way that B is not involved, right? And so because of that, I think that the method of doubt is itself doubtful. Thanks very much.
So you were careful to point out that the conclusion of the argument from doubt in Ibn Sīnā is different from the conclusion of Descartes' argument, because the distinction between soul and body is something that comes later in the Meditations, but Ibn Sīnā gets straight there. So I wanted to invite you to relate that to something you said at the end, that in order to be sure that their conception is complete, they have to defend their definition.
Yeah.
What's Ibn Sīnā's definition of the thing that he thinks he knows exists independently of the body?
Yeah, that's actually that's a very good question and a difficult one. So he thinks that the soul is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to define because it's simple. So it's like trying to define God. So actually his way of answering that question would basically be negative. So he would say, well, I grasp this without grasping the body. So whatever the self or the soul is, it's not the body. But he's pretty reluctant to then tell you a positive definition, unlike Descartes. So Descartes says the definition of soul is thinking being or thinking substance. And we don't have anything quite like that in Sīnā, although he does, I mean, this is too complicated to go into, but he does later try to prove the incorporeality of the soul a second time by appealing to the fact that it thinks. And he says it wouldn't be able to do that if it were a body. So in that sense, they're similar.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of God, so you said a lot about the comparison between Descartes and Ibn Sīnā on these different arguments from doubt, the appeal to doubt. When you were talking about Ibn Sīnā on the triangle, that the only thing whose existence is not doubtful, given that I understand it's the definition or the conception, is God, I was so strongly reminded of the ontological argument there. I mean, is there a historical link? It seems too good to be true.
Right. So there's no historical link. So Anselm is around the same time as Ibn Sīnā, actually. But there's no textual link between them. Sometimes people argue that Avicenna or Ibn Sīnā is giving some kind of ontological argument, but it actually doesn't work quite the same way. So I didn't go through Ibn Sīnā's proof of the existence of God, but his proof is not, I define God as a necessary existent, therefore God must exist. That's not what he does. He says, God is a necessary existent, now let me show you there is such a thing. And the way he does that is he argues by reductio. So in other words, he assumes what he's trying to prove is false. So he says, imagine that everything that exists is only possible. So there is no necessary existent. Well, what would happen? Long story, but long story short is everything would just kind of hover waiting to be preponderated to exist, right? So nothing would ever actually exist. And so we need a necessary existent to explain why all these contingent or possible things have in fact wound up existing. Now, some people think that that's ontological somehow, but it looks like a cosmological argument, actually.
Got it. Right. Thank you. Last question, and it's a question of a different kind. And so, to make clear what I'm getting at, let's use a couple of examples from the Western tradition, Aristotle and Hume. So there's lots and lots of scholarly work on these two figures. But it's also the case that they're still of extreme interest to people who are not scholars. So Hume on the self, Hume on causation, Hume on skepticism, Aristotle on the virtues, etc., are debated now as if they were contemporary issues. What do you think is the most living bit of medieval Islamic philosophy today?
That's interesting. So, I mean, I think there's actually two ways of going at that. One is to think of it just as a historical phenomenon and why it's interesting and important from that point of view. And of course, for all kinds of reasons, it's politically and culturally relevant to point out that there was this incredible philosophical tradition, that it helped shape European philosophy, that it wasn't entirely, that it didn't fulfill its historical destiny, like I was saying, by helping to shape European philosophy, but that it has its own kind of intrinsic interest and also continues on its own trajectory. So there's all that historical stuff, which I think is important for thinking about things like the contemporary relationship between Europe and the Islamic world.
Yes.
Okay. But setting all that aside, that's maybe the more obvious thing, which also, of course, applies to other non-European cultures like African philosophy, Indian, Chinese philosophy, Latin American philosophy. Okay, but setting all that aside, there's just some really cool philosophy in here. So, I mean, if there's some pieces of philosophy that are like these little gems that you can just hand people. One of them is the ontological argument, actually, and there are others, right? But one of them is the flying man argument. So I have taught the flying man argument to kids, like young high schoolers, and they go for it immediately. It's very easy to get them to start thinking about it, right? And in some ways, it's actually a lot. I mean, if you told me I have to get a bunch of 13-year-olds interested in a philosophical problem, I would much rather go with the flying man argument than the cogito. Because okay, imagine that you're trying to doubt everything. Like, so can you think of anything you can't doubt? Like a very abstract, weird question. Whereas, imagine this guy is created in midair and he has no memory and he's not in contact, blah, 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 right? That's interesting. Also, I didn't do Avicenna's proof of the existence of God, but his proof for the existence of God is the best proof for the existence of God. It's very, very powerful. The fine-tuning argument's also pretty good, let's face it. But in terms of historical arguments for the existence of God, first of all, it's a very clever proof. And second of all, I think it's the only pre-modern proof that actually captures the reason people believe in God. Because people don't believe in, except for Bertrand Russell, who strangely is coming up again. There's this story about Bertrand Russell walking through the streets of Cambridge and then suddenly realizing the ontological argument works and becoming a theist for like an hour or something, right? I don't remember the whole story, but there's something about that. But nobody believes in God because of the ontological argument, but people do believe in God because roughly, hey, look around, all this could not be here, and yet here it is. And Avicenna's proof is a technical way of capturing that intuition. So I think it's actually a brilliant piece of philosophy. Both of those are brilliant pieces of philosophy that still absolutely work today.
Lots more to say, evidently. Over to you for questions, please. There's a roving mic, so wait till it reaches you. Put your hands up if you... Yes, there's somebody at the back.
Hi. Okay, I'm going to try and word this well. Doesn't the flying man argument, isn't it baked into it the assumption that that person would be aware of themselves?
Yeah.
Intuitively, I think, well, if they've got no memories, if they've got no concept of language, then there would be no self-awareness. Because self-awareness, when you think of it in terms of your own self-awareness, is based around...
Yeah. So I think this thought experiment has in common with a lot of thought experiments that it trades on a kind of intuition, which you may just not share, right? So Ibn Sīnā, when he says the flying man would be aware of his own existence, he doesn't give an argument for that. He just thinks it's obvious. However, he does talk about self-awareness elsewhere. Interestingly, it seems that his own students were very provoked by the flying man experiment. So we have it in this in one of his major works, but then we have longer discussions of it again in works that seem to be records of debates he had with his own students. And they seem to have been really fascinated by this and by the phenomenon of self-awareness in general. And there he does give some kind of additional material, at least, that you could perhaps use to convince yourself the intuition is true. So one thing he says is that whenever you have any kind of cognition, like thinking of a triangle, you don't just think of the triangle, but you're also at least tacitly aware that you are thinking of the triangle, that you are thinking of the triangle. So your self-awareness is, as it were, presupposed by and is a precondition for any other form of cognition, okay? So that doesn't prove that the flying man is aware of himself, but it does tend to show that self-awareness is somehow more primitive or basic than, for example, the ability to form linguistic thoughts or the ability to imagine or anything else. It's kind of there in the background all the time. And in fact, Ibn Sīnā says that people are even self-aware when they're asleep or blind drunk, because even if they're not actively self-aware, they must be self-aware like in a way that they're not aware of.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a very weird idea that he has that people are tacitly self-aware all the time. And I think this is kind of true. Maybe this is true. So imagine you're walking down a busy London street, so you're dodging the bicycles and the black cabs and everything, right? So obviously you're not thinking, here I am walking down a London street, right? But you always could think that. So you can kind of, and you are somehow conscious, right? So what Ibn Sīnā would say about that is that you have a kind of background self-awareness that you can always make salient for yourself, even though you often don't do it. And that's, in a way, almost what consciousness is, perhaps, for him. Although, of course, he doesn't talk about it in those terms. But, I mean, as far as the thought experiment goes, you have to buy the intuition. If you don't, then he has to try something else.
Let's have right at the front second, stay near where you are, at the very back on your right. Yeah.
Hi. So this is my first introduction to any non-Western philosophy, which I think is quite criminal in terms of the education system. But there was a question that I sort of wanted to build on that Edward Harcourt asked, which was on the fact that to defeat the masked man fallacy, both ideas that you have to be properly defined, or as Avicenna said, have a complete grasp on those ideas. And he asked about, I reckon, the more complicated one, which is having a complete definition of the soul, which obviously would be quite difficult. But even the other definition for the other idea that you're working with, being the body, seems to be quite hard to define, especially from the perspective of a modern audience looking back at the amount of scientific progress that we've made since then. Could Avicenna have claimed to even be able to define the body?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, I'm going to give a somewhat historical answer to that question. So, I mean, obviously he doesn't have access to modern physics, right? But what he does have access to is Aristotle. And in Aristotelian science, the way that you proceed is you have definitions, and then you use definitions to prove further truths about things, right? So a great example would be, I know the definition of triangle, and using just the definition of triangle, its essence. Of course, a definition is just a kind of expression of the essence of the thing, right? So using just the definition of triangle, I can prove, for example, that its internal degrees are equal to 180 degrees, okay? So for them, that's how science is supposed to work in general. So for example, if I'm doing natural philosophy, then I might have a definition of, let's say, motion, or time, or place. The reason he's so keen to eliminate the idea of void space is that he thinks that the definition of place is incompatible with it, right? So they're always going to say, well, science starts with definitions and builds out from them, and the whole project of science will be just as tenable as the availability of real definitions that completely capture the essences of things. So anyone who says that we don't have definitions says that we can't do science. And they would just assume that that's ridiculous, right? Of course we do science all the time, right? Now, if looking back, we might say, well, yeah, you were doing science, but your science was all rubbish, right? It's not entirely clear whether that's true. Like, they would have thought of metaphysics and mathematics as sciences, and maybe their metaphysics and mathematics were correct. But obviously their natural philosophy was not. But I think what they would, if you could sort of teleport him or time travel him to now and explain all the modern physics stuff, he would say, okay, but still, I still believe in essences, and you just have different definitions than I did, and maybe your definitions are better, so you've made progress, congratulations, but the big picture is the same. We start with definitions and we demonstrate what we can on that basis. Actually, there were philosophers at the time or shortly thereafter, like Fakhruddin Razi, the guy I mentioned a couple of times. He thought that you can't give definitions, real definitions of essences, and that therefore the whole project was bankrupt. But that's what the stakes are. So basically, if you think Aristotelian science is possible, you have to believe that it's possible to give real definitions.
Okay, let's go to the front then, please. I'll come back to you.
Well, annoyingly, my question's very similar to what's just been asked, but this idea of complete understanding, and to completely understand something, it's not obvious to me that you could completely understand something, because you would have to know that you completely understand it, and that could always be,
Right.
you wouldn't know it unless
Okay.
you knew everything.
Yeah.
But you can never know that. So Newtonian physics, we thought solved motion, and then relativistic physics comes along. But Newton wouldn't have been able to know that, and he would have thought that he would have solved it. So you might think you know everything about the mind and know that it's completely separate from the body, but then someone comes along, it's not true anymore.
Right.
They have to have some sort of block against that. Actually.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. Actually, that's not quite the same question, because you're introducing a new sort of layer, which is not just how is it even possible, or should I believe that is possible, but you're asking something different, which is for any given definition, how do I know that that's the real definition? Okay. So the first thing to say about this is that they recognize the availability of several different kinds of definitions. So one is sometimes called a nominal definition, and a nominal definition is different from a real definition. So what's the difference? A nominal definition is just any definition that picks out the thing accurately. So for example, what are triangles? They are the geometrical plane. They are the figures that look most like pieces of pizza. Okay? Not a good definition, not a real definition, but it captures the triangles, right? You got the triangles. So that's a nominal definition. What is a human? It's an animal that has 2 feet and no feathers. Okay? So that's a nominal definition. And in that case, the definition is just as good as whether it gets the right sort of set of things. Okay? But you're not going to use that for science. Then you have an incomplete real definition. So a triangle is a plane figure. Stop. That's good because it's part of the scientific definition, but it's not the whole thing. Okay, now real definition, let's say its triangle is 3-sided plane figure. That's the real definition. So actually, in technical terms, your question is, how do I know that my complete scientific definitions are not merely nominal definitions? Okay? And the answer is actually probably what you just said, namely that it exists in some kind of network with other essences that kind of mutually support each other. And I have not just this one little bit of science, triangles. I'm really good on triangles, right? But you have your grasp of triangles, and it's embedded within geometry. Okay, so I think so that's one way they can go, a kind of coherentist way of thinking about it, as we would now say. Another way they might go, though, is to say, well, when you have a real definition, you'll know, right? Because it's just what a triangle is, right? Actually, one thing that this guy Fakhreddin said against this is, well, actually, whenever you give a definition, you're only explaining to somebody what you mean by something, and you can mean whatever you want. So definitions are kind of arbitrary, from his point of view, or if they're so that's the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that you would already have to know what it is before you gave a definition. So definitions aren't going to ever give you any help. They're just going to express what you already think, right? So people around the time were making that kind of objection.
Okay, there was one right at the back. Sorry to send you back and forth.
You're getting your steps in.
It's good.
Thanks. So one thing that my sort of university lecturers always brought home to me about Descartes is the importance of subjectivity in his method, like the first-person perspective. So everyone reading the Meditations must find out their own existence and they discover their own existence and find the idea of God within themselves and so on and so on. Whereas Ibn Sina's Flying Man seems very much like a hypothetical third person. Do you think this meaningfully affects either of their arguments, or is this just a featured style?
That's a great question. So actually, as I said, the Flying Man argument appears several times in Ibn Sina's works. And interestingly, he vacillates between a first person and third person way of putting it. So in the sort of most famous version, the one I was quoting from first, he says, let us suppose that God creates a human, right? What would he know? But there's another version elsewhere in his works where he says, one of us should imagine that he is created in midair and then ask himself, what would he know? And of course, he's assuming the reader is a guy, right? Because it's medieval Persia. So but we can put it in gender neutral language. So each of us should imagine that they are created in midair, and then they should just see that they would, under those circumstances, know. So I think actually in some ways the third person perspective might be a little bit better, because if you imagine that you yourself have just been created, then there's maybe a danger that you're going to sort of forget that you're not allowed to bring in your memories and imagination and so on, right? So it's quite nice if you have this sort of third person case where we imagine this other person who's just been created, whose cognitive setup is very different from ours, rather than a first person formulation where I'm imagining myself into the situation of someone like that. But the fact that he gives both formulations might show that he himself was aware that it doesn't make any difference, because ultimately the argument should work either way. Now, with all due respect to your lecturer, I wonder whether we could say the same thing about Descartes. So couldn't Descartes say, well, let's take my friend Mary. So she had this horrible upbringing, black and white room, was sort of abusive, but when she got past that, she then tried to doubt everything, right? And then Mary asked herself, is there anything she couldn't doubt? And then she noticed she can't doubt that she thinks, right? Now, I'm not sure that it has less force than the first person version of the cogito, or if it does have less force, I want to know why. Maybe the thought your lecturer was having is, well, to verify that Mary would know that she's thinking, I have to kind of do it myself and then extrapolate from my own experience to her experience. But I'm not sure that's true, actually, because I think that it depends how you think the cogito works. And there's obviously a topic on which there's a mountain of literature, right? But some people think the way that it works is that the existence of the subject is a precondition for asking the question of existence, right? And I think that we can, as third-person observers, see that Mary's existence is a precondition for her asking whether or not she exists. Therefore, it's a contradiction for Mary to suppose that she doesn't exist. So I think actually it does work for both of them. It works whether it's first person or third person. But I might be wrong.
Okay, also the back on the other side of the bill.
Hi. It's been a while since I studied this. I think it was like 2022, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I remember it was classified as a pointer and not so much like the fully fleshed out demonstration.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask as a follow-up question from your question, actually. Could that be because we can't really put ourselves like in the flying man's shoes? Like we can't really imagine what it's like to be him. Right. And that seems to be a problem if what is known is going to be distinct from what is unknown. So if we can't really know what it's like to be the flying man, why would that be true for us?
Right.
And that seems to be maybe one reason why it wouldn't really work as a demonstration, but it can be like a pointer towards the truth. Because when I imagine myself as the flying man, I feel like it would just be, like you might have awareness, but I really don't think it could be self-awareness. And maybe this is like the German idealism coming back in my brain. But so long as you don't have a not I to distinguish yourself from, I feel like you would just have awareness as such, and maybe you would intuit all of existence, but you wouldn't really know where you end and the rest of the world begins. If that makes sense?
Yep. Yeah. So where did you study this?
In college. Okay. We had an Arabic philosophy class.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great to hear. Okay, so you remembered exactly right. So he says at the end of the most famous passage that I was talking about, the one with the third person formulation, at the end he says, thereby we have a tanbih towards realizing that the soul is not the body. And tanbih can be translated in different ways. but I would probably translate it as admonition. So there's another work by Ibn Sīnā called Isharat wa Tanbihat, so pointers and reminders, or pointers, or indications and admonitions. It's the second word in that title, tanbih. And some people have fastened on to that word and suggested that it's a sign of Ibn Sīnā wanting to bring the kind of evidentiary value of the flying man way down. So it's not a proof, like he could have said it was a proof or a demonstration, like a dalil or a burhan in Arabic. Just in case so A, in case anyone here knows Arabic, and B, so I can show off. So he could have used these other words, right? But he didn't. He uses the word tanbih, which means just a kind of like bringing something to mind. It's almost like bringing something to mind that you already know. That's kind of what it means, right? So, and then he says something interesting after that. He says, but if the person is not perspicacious enough to make use of this, then he will need another way to grasp that the soul is distinct from the body. And this might actually go back to what the first questioner asked, which is, well, what if I just don't share the intuition? I think what Ibn Sīnā would say is, well, didn't work on you, but that's your fault. You're not perspicacious, right? Now, Fedor Benovich and I, in our article on this, we actually resist this kind of bar lowering move, because we say, well, actually, the argument is supposed to be very powerful. It does have a limitation, which is that it doesn't exclude these accidental or extrinsic relationships between the soul and the body, right? And it doesn't even show you that the soul could survive the death of the body, for that matter. But the reason he calls it a tanbih is because it's alerting you to your self-awareness and then exploiting that to prove something. Okay, that's our reading. About the other thing you said, which is very interesting, and I think is a kind of independent point. So you said, well, maybe the flying man is aware, but not aware of himself. He's maybe aware of something like, let's say, existence. So actually, Ibn Sīnā says what he's aware of is his own existence, or the existence of his own essence, actually, is what he says, or of his own self, depending on how you translate it. And then you might say, well, like sort of Martin Buber style, like there's sort of I and thou, right? So if there's only me and there's no one to delimit myself from, then that's not a concept of me yet. That's just, here is something, right? But what Ibn Sīnā would say against that, this goes back to what I was saying about, well, self-awareness is presupposed by every cognitive act. He thinks that self-awareness is really having a first-person perspective, right? So it's, I'm seeing you right now. It's me seeing you right now. And my self-awareness is needed for me to have an experience of myself seeing you, as opposed to just picture of you or like the seeing of you. So I'm not just having a seeing of you. I am seeing you. I'm experiencing it. And this is what Ibn Sīnā thinks self-awareness is. So he would think that the I-ness of self-awareness is really built into the nature of self-awareness.
So wouldn't that require me to be an external object that you're seeing, and then you're distinguishing yourself from me, and then you can say, I am seeing you?
Yes. Yeah. But his point is that the seeing, in a way he's saying there's two things going on when I see you. One is the seeing, and the other is self-awareness. And self-awareness is what enables me to be aware that it's me seeing you, right? So the way that the seeing gets kind of connected to me is by being kind of hooked up to my self-awareness. That's his idea, at least. Now, maybe that's not right? Maybe if we could get enough money from the British government, we could actually do the flying man thought experiments and then ask the flying man afterwards, so what did you know? But the point is, this is all connected to quite a complex and nuanced theory of self-awareness. It's not just, hey, wouldn't he know himself? Right? There's more going on than that.
Thank you.
Yes, we have one in the middle here on this side.
I a stupid sort of train of thought that that has already been answered, but I'm just interested about whether it's a purely human kind of self-awareness, or whether you can reduce and sort of say, well, because the flying man has a lot of the traits that we might associate language and so on are absent. So, but it's still assumed that there's a self-awareness there. So maybe a chimpanzee or a whale or something else with a mind broad enough. But then if we sort of go back down the evolutionary ladder, is there a point where it becomes, okay, well, that's a mechanical thing? You know, could you have a flying ant? You know, would that have any kind of self-awareness? And at what point, you know, how does that? Because if then there's a connection between the complexity of the organism and the ability to have self-awareness, does that not intrinsically tie?
Right. So this is the moment where you would all expect me to say, unfortunately, this question was never addressed in the tradition, but it was. So there's a philosopher named Mullah Sadra who works in the 17th century in Persia, and he said, oh, actually the flying man would work with an animal too. So a flying animal would be also aware of itself. And although Ibn Sina doesn't address that question, I think there's good reason for him to agree. Okay, so to give the full story, I'd have to delve into his whole psychological theory, but to make a long story short, what Ibn Sina would say is, sort of following Aristotle and then the medical tradition and so on, he would say that we have a whole range of cognitive powers or faculties, which mostly are seated in the body. So, for example, our imagination and memory are seated in different parts of the brain, he says. Actually, you can almost see them in my case, because there's no hair in the way. So, for example, you remember with the back of your brain, and you imagine with the middle of your brain. And animals have these powers too. And amongst them would be also sensation, right? The only thing that differentiates us from animals psychologically is the power to grasp abstract ideas, which he calls universal intelligibles. So insofar as his argument about self-awareness is, well, anytime that I have any kind of cognitive activity going on, I can sort of I can make it salient for myself that it's me who's having the cognitive activity, and I can kind of connect it to myself, as I was saying before. And animals should be able to do that too, at least tacitly. So I think the thing an interesting question to pose to Ibn Sina would, because remember my example of walking down the London street, right? So you can suddenly sort of think, here I am, right? So imagine you almost get hit by a truck and you don't, and you're like, oh, thank God, I'm still alive, right? So that might be the kind of thing that would make you saliently aware that you're existing, right? And I'm not sure what Ibn Sina would say about whether an animal could do that, could like turn on their active awareness, their active self-awareness. But I think he should think that they are at least tacitly self-aware all the time, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to have first-person perspective cognitive activities. And I think that's what Mullah Sadra was noticing, actually. So that's a really good question.
Thank you. In Buddhist philosophy, there is the idea of anatta, or the idea of the lack of being or self.
Yeah.
So my question here is there a possibility or a capability for us to distinguish between the nominal definition and the incomplete but real definition of self?
Yeah, okay. So that's actually a really interesting thing to bring into the conversation. So, there's some historical questions about how the Buddhist no-self theory, how and when it emerges. But let's just take the kind of standard story, which is that the Buddhist no-self theory is a rejection of the Vedic self theory. Okay, so we have these the kind of roots of Vedic philosophical literature, which we see in the earliest Upanishads, right? So even in the very oldest of the Upanishads, we have these passages that say, all right, well, there's all these things of which I am conscious, and then underneath that, as it were, like salt dissolved in water, is the consciousness that belongs to the self. And it's a very similar move to the move Ibn Sina is making, that self-awareness somehow precedes all other cognition, okay? That's already there, let's say, in, I don't know, like well before the Common Era. We have that in Upanishadic literature. Later on, of course, we even get Vedic thinkers, like in Vedanta, saying that that's the only reality that there is and that everything else is an illusion. That's Advaita Vedanta, right? So that's a very characteristic feature of Vedic philosophy. Now, the Buddhists reject that, and they say, no. All there is these transient, ephemeral cognitive experiences, and there is no consciousness, set core or center of consciousness that's presupposed by them. So Ibn Sīnā basically would agree with the Vedic side against the Buddhist side, right? And the challenge for the Buddhist is to explain how that could be. And now you might wonder, well, how am I going to tell the difference, right? So actually something else that the Vedic thinkers sometimes say is that the self cannot be a direct object of consciousness, right? So that's, I guess, the point about the salt dissolved in the water, right? There's nothing kind of there, but you can taste that the water is salty, right? So it's sort of pervading your whole experience, that you can't just pay attention to yourself because it's this sort of presupposition of experience rather than a possible object of experience. And that makes it sound like the Buddhists could be right. But what the Vedic schools would say is things like, well, if you don't have a unified self that's consciousness of all the other things that are going on, then you can't explain the unity of experience, right? So how is it that, so you're all like, almost all of you are sitting down. So I bring it to your attention that you're touching a chair. Right? So you can all sort of touch the chair, right, with your back and thighs and so on, right? And you're also looking at me, right? And here's something else you're aware of. The same one who's touching the chair is also seeing me, right? These two things are somehow belonging to the same subject. How could that be true if there's not a core self, right? And that's very similar to the move Ibn Sīnā's making. Another thing they would say is that if the Buddhists deny the reality of the self, they can't explain identity across time. So none of you are the same self that you were when you started listening to me talk, because there is no self. And of course, the Buddhists just bite the bullet on that and say, exactly, there is no enduring self, right? So I think it's a very interesting debate, and it's very closely related to the point that Ibn Sīnā is making. Before anyone asks me, no, I don't think there's a historical connection, but I wouldn't rule it out, because actually there was some knowledge of Buddhist philosophy in very early Islam, but I don't really see any reason to think that that's come into Ibn Sīnā's thinking about self-awareness.
Well, I'm afraid we need to draw things to a close there. Thank you very much for your questions. Apologies to those of you who had questions and didn't have the opportunity to ask them. But thanks above all to Peter for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.